皆様こんにちは。ベーカーのマッケンジー法律事務所東京オフィスパートナーのMasumotoと申します。本ビデオシリーズでは私Masumotoと弊社東京オフィスパートナーのDominic Sharman弁護士がモデレーターとなりまして、様々な国でビジネスを行う日本企業の皆様に各国の国際仲裁制度の概要をご紹介することを目的として、弊社の各国オフィスから国際仲裁案件を数多く取り扱う弁護士をスピーカーに迎え、その国の国際仲裁制度の概要や昨今の動向、また日本企業の皆様に向けたアドバイスなどについてお話をさせていただきます。第3弾は今回から2回にわたりまして、東京ミーツベトナムと題し、弊社ハノイオフィスにて多くの仲裁案件を取り扱っております、パートナーのTri Quach弁護士とアソシエイトのQuan Hoang弁護士をスピーカーに迎え、ベトナムにおける国際仲裁の概要や動向などをお届けさせていただきます。なお本シリーズは英語で進めさせていただきますが、最後に私より日本語で概要をご説明いたしますので、最後までご覧になっていただけますと幸いです。So, hi Dom, Chi and Quan. So the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Mika, and thank you for Chi and Quan for joining us today. First, I wanted to ask if you could give us an overview of the arbitration system in Vietnam.
Thank you, Dom. I will be taking this good question. So, arbitration in Vietnam, I believe it has developed significantly over the past decade, and it is an important topic for foreign investors and business traders, business companies, including Japanese companies, when they do business in Vietnam or make investments in Vietnam. The Vietnam arbitration system is governed by the law on commercial arbitration, which was adopted in 2010. And that law is based on the ancestral model law. It means that the principles of the Vietnamese law on commercial arbitrations are generally aligned with the international standards. That's what we believe. For example, there are some key principles are being adopted in the Vietnamese law on commercial arbitrations, including the principle on the party autonomy, the principle on competence, meaning that the arbitral tribunal has the authority to rule on its own jurisdiction. And there are limited grounds for setting aside arbitral awards, including violations of fundamental principles of Vietnamese law. So there is a number of arbitration centers in Vietnam, but we believe that the main arbitration center in Vietnam is the Vietnam International Arbitration Center, VIAC, which handles most of the commercial disputes in Vietnam. So there is a report by VIAC. In 2024, VIAC handled 475 dispute arbitration cases. So currently, the Vietnamese government is in the process of drafting decrees to implement the National Assembly's resolutions to establish the very first Vietnam International Financial Center. And it is very important to note that amongst the new decree that the government is going to issue, there will be one decree that allows the parties in the IFC to agree that they will waive the right to request for setting aside arbitral awards. It means that if they agree to waive the right to request for setting aside arbitral award, then the arbitral award will be the final decision, and it will go directly to the enforcement process. So, talking about the enforcement, Vietnam is a signatory to the New York Convention. Therefore, the foreign arbitral awards from other New York Convention members, they can be enforced here in Vietnam. Of course, they need to go through the local recognition and enforcement process before competent local courts. However, the way we see it is that the number of foreign arbitral awards recognized and enforced in Vietnam has been increasing in the recent years, which we believe is a positive indications. However, the procedure, there are still some challenges, including the delays or even the inconsistent of some local court interpretations of the law, particularly how an arbitral award is contrary to the fundamental principle of Vietnamese law. One of the legal grounds for a local court not to recognize a foreign arbitral award is that the award itself or the enforcement of that award could be contrary to the fundamental principles of Vietnamese law. However, there is no official guidance of what would be the fundamental principles of Vietnamese law. So far, this is a gray area. Therefore, we have seen some differences in the interpretations of this concept, fundamental principles of Vietnamese law. So, arbitration is increasingly used for cross-border disputes, especially in the sector like construction, infrastructure, energy, and trading activities in Vietnam. We do have a strong belief that arbitrations will become more popular dispute resolution method in Vietnam in the coming years.
Thanks so much, Chi, for that input. That certainly echoes what I hear about the Vietnam arbitration scene, and also I know we commonly help clients, whether from Japan or otherwise, with those issues of enforcement in the courts. That leads on to the second question, which is whether international arbitration is popular in Vietnam.
Thank you, Dom. I'll be taking this question. Our short answer is yes, international arbitration is gaining popularity in Vietnam. While litigation still dominates for domestic disputes and it is mandatory for civil and other non-commercial matters, arbitration is definitely growing in popularity in Vietnam, especially for commercial cases. So traditionally, Vietnamese businesses relied on court litigation. But in recent years, we observed that arbitration has become increasingly preferred because it offers neutrality, confidentiality, and the advantage of enforceability under the New York Convention. So for example, the Vietnam International Arbitration Center, VIAC, like Chi mentioned previously, they handled nearly 500 cases last year, up from just 270 cases in 2021. And this rapid growth reflects Vietnam's deeper integration into global trade and investment. And we observe that there are several reasons for this trend. Firstly, only a small percentage of domestic arbitral awards are set aside by the Vietnamese courts. Typically, this number is around 6 to 10% annually. Secondly, local courts and judges are receiving more training in arbitration, and this helps to build trust in the process. In addition, foreign investors often prefer arbitration over local courts, especially for complex or high-value disputes. And by way of an update, as of July 2025, only the most experienced courts in Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh City, and Da Nang can hear set-aside applications. And this helps to ensure consistency and expertise. And like Chi just mentioned, recent reforms and new institutions like the Arbitration Center of the International Financial Center in Vietnam are making arbitration even more attractive. And lastly, while the refusal rate for recognition of foreign arbitral awards is still relatively high, around 49%, the situation is improving as Vietnam continues to update its legal framework and court practices. So, in conclusion, while litigation remains the default avenue for many domestic disputes, international arbitration is becoming much more popular in Vietnam, especially among foreign investors and for cross-border commercial matters. Thank you, Dom.
Thanks so much again for that input. It's interesting to hear how the difference between domestic and international arbitration is still a factor. That kind of leads on to the next question, which is whether Japanese companies should choose domestic arbitration in Vietnam or international arbitration, for example, in Singapore, and what factors matter when they're making that decision.
We believe that each option has advantages and disadvantages. So the enforcement of an arbitral decision, including the interim injunction orders by the arbitral award, I believe it is one of the most crucial factors that the parties will need to take into consideration. So under the current Vietnamese law, the Vietnamese court only support the local arbitration centers and the foreign arbitration centers that have a presence in Vietnam. What does that mean? It means that only the final foreign arbitration award can be enforced in Vietnam under the New York Convention. And the interim injunction ordered may not be able to enforce in Vietnam because the interim injunction orders, they are not the final decision. Only the decisions, the interim injunction orders or decisions by domestic arbitration centers or foreign arbitration centers with presence in Vietnam, only interim injunctions orders from those centers, they can be enforced in Vietnam directly. And this is really important factor. Why? Because if you want to enforce, if you see the possibility that you need to obtain an interim injunction order against the local party, the Vietnamese local party, then you really need to think about using a domestic international arbitration center so that you can enforce the injunction orders directly. An example of the contract where the interim injunction orders might be necessary would be the case where the local party is a buyer or the borrower. In that case, speaking from our prior experience, there are some circumstances where the Japanese party may need to obtain an injunction order, such as the freezing orders against the local parties, the Vietnamese party bank accounts, just to make sure that the local parties will not disperse or transfer money from that account to another account. So going back to the enforcement issues, if you select a domestic arbitration center, you have an advantage, very clear advantage, to obtain an interim injunction order, such as the freezing order against the local party's bank account, and bring that injunction order to the enforcement authority and enforce it in Vietnam. So I believe this is a very important factor for the Japanese investors and companies to take into consideration. The second factor, as we believe, is that again, it's also about the enforcement of the award. Because if you obtain a positive award and you cannot enforce that award, then it may not give you benefits that you are expecting. So it is really important to locate the substantial access of the Vietnamese party. Of course, if the Vietnamese party, most of their access are located in Vietnam, so you may need to think about the situation where you need to enforce the award, whether or not it is an arbitral award by an international center, arbitration center, or domestic center in Vietnam against the access of the local Vietnamese party. And like I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, if it is an award by a domestic arbitration center, you can bring that award to the enforcement authority for a direct enforcement process. Of course, unless the losing party brings that award to a competent court, requesting the court to set aside that award. However, if it is an award by a foreign arbitration center, then you need to bring that award to a Vietnamese court for recognition before you can bring the award to the enforcement authority for enforcement process. So you can see the difference between a Vietnamese arbitral award and a foreign arbitral award. It is about the enforcement process. If it is a Vietnamese arbitral award, you have a better chance to enforce it directly. If it is a foreign arbitral award, you may need to go through the local enforcement recognition and enforcement process before a Vietnamese court, before you can start the enforcement process in Vietnam. So that is a second factor. Of course, if the access of the Vietnamese party, if you can locate access of Vietnamese party in other countries, such as in Japan, then you can see the possibility to enforce the arbitral award, not only in Vietnam, but also in other countries. And in such a case, of course, the advantage of the domestic arbitral centers may no longer exist, may no longer be an advantage. The third factor that we believe is really important is, of course, the technical aspects of the project or the dispute. How likely the parties will need to use international experts. For example, in construction projects, there is a high possibility, or it is very popular, that the parties may need to use international one-to-one experts or delay experts in case a dispute arises. And apparently, for international arbitration centers, they have a more experience and they should be more familiar with the decisions and with the opinions by international one-to-one and delay experts. So in such a case, the use of international arbitration center will have a clear advantage over domestic arbitration centers. So by and large, we believe that there are at least three key factors that Japanese companies and investors should take into consideration when they select domestic or international arbitration centers in the dispute resolution clause. Number one, whether or not they need to obtain an interim injunction against the Vietnamese local party. Number two, the enforcement of the arbitral award against the access of the Vietnamese party. And what is the location of the Vietnamese party's access in Vietnam or in other countries? And number three, the technical aspects of the project, whether or not, how likely you need to obtain the opinions from international one-to-one, delay experts, and other experts in such a case.
Thanks for setting out those three factors so clearly on that. It leads on to the last question. You mentioned obviously construction there, but what kind of industries commonly end up in arbitration in Vietnam?
Thank you, Dom. So for this question, let me refer to recent reports from the Vietnam International Arbitration Center, VIAC. So according to these reports, the industries that most commonly involved in arbitration in Vietnam, the first industry is sale of goods and trade, which makes up about 25% of VIAC's cases. And these disputes often relate to delivery delays, quality, and payment obligations. The second industry is construction and infrastructure, which makes up around 22% of the disputes at VIAC. These disputes often involve large-scale projects with foreign contractors, and they typically arise over delays, cost overruns, and technical issues. The third industry is real estate, which makes up about 14%. And this type of disputes often involve disagreements over development agreements and joint ventures. And the last industry is banking and finance, as well as service and logistics. These are also the types of disputes that feature regularly in arbitration cases. And the reason that these sectors see more arbitration is that they usually involve long-term, high-value contracts and a significant amount of foreign investment or cross-border transactions. Disputes in these industries often require specialized expertise as well, and arbitration is very suited to provide this. And as Vietnam's economy continues to open up and attract international businesses, arbitration is becoming an increasingly popular way to resolve these complex disputes in these key sectors.
Thank you to both of you for all of your input. This is now the end of part one. So I'll pass over to Mika for a bit of a summary in Japanese. お願いします。
Thank you for your explanation and insightful comments. それでは私から簡単に日本語で概要をお伝えさせていただきます。まず、ベトナムにおける仲裁制度の概要についてですけれども、ベトナムにおける国際仲裁は過去10年間で著しく発展しているということです。ベトナムの仲裁システムはアンソラルのモデル法に従った商事仲裁法に基づいており、国際基準におおむね整合しているということでした。主要な仲裁機関は VIAC、ベトナムインターナショナルアービトレーションセンターであるということですけれども、現在、国際金融センターを IFC ですね、を設立するための政令が起草されており、その IFC 内に仲裁センターを設立することも検討されているということです。なお、IFC 内の仲裁では、当事者が仲裁判断の取り消しを請求する権利を放棄することが認められるそうです。執行に関しては、ニューヨーク条約の締約国ですので、外国の仲裁判断はベトナム国内で執行可能であり、実際承認執行される外国の仲裁判断の件数は近年増加傾向にあるということでした。ただし、手続き上の遅延や裁判所の解釈が一貫していないといった課題が依然として存在するということでして、特に問題点としては、外国の仲裁判断がベトナム法の基本原則に反するかという判断において、裁判所に広範な裁量権が与えられているという点があるということでした。仲裁は特に建設、インフラ、エネルギー、貿易などの分野におけるクロスボーダーの紛争解決手段として利用されているということです。次に、ベトナムで国際仲裁が普及しているかという点につきましては、仲裁の利用は増加しているということでして、例えば VIAC が昨年取り扱った案件数は約500件で、2021年の2270件から大幅に増加しているということでした。利用が拡大している理由としましては、ベトナム国内の仲裁判断については、国内裁判所によって取り消される割合はごくわずかであること、国内の裁判所や裁判官に対する仲裁に関するトレーニングが多くなされていること、また複雑で高額な紛争において、外国の投資家は国内の裁判所よりも仲裁を信頼していることが挙げられるということでした。また、国内の仲裁判断の取り消しについては、ハノイ、ホーチミンシティ、ダナンの裁判所のみが管轄権を有するということです。最近の改革や IFC の仲裁センターのような新しい制度は、ベトナムでの仲裁をより魅力的なものにしているということでした。外国の仲裁判断の承認が拒否される確率は約 49% と、依然として高い数字ではありますが、このような点についても状況は改善されてきているということです。次に日本企業はベトナムの国内仲裁と、例えばシンガポール仲裁といった外国の国際仲裁のどちらを選ぶべきかという点につきましては、外国の仲裁判断については、ニューヨーク条約に基づき、ベトナムで執行が可能なのは最終の仲裁判断のみでして、暫定的な差し止め命令については執行されない可能性があるということです。また、国内の仲裁判断については、ベトナムの裁判所によって取り消されない限り、ベトナムにおいて直接執行が可能ですけれども、 外国の仲裁判断については、まずベトナムの裁判所による承認が必要となるということでした。従いまして、日本企業がベトナム企業と契約を締結する際に、紛争解決手段として、ベトナムの国内仲裁を選ぶべきか、その他の国の国際仲裁を選ぶべきかという点については、紛争が発生したときに、暫定的な差し止め命令を求める必要性がどの程度あるか、また、ベトナム企業は日本や他国に資産を有していて、仮にベトナム国内で仲裁判断が承認されない場合であっても、他国で仲裁判断を執行することがあり得るかといった点を考慮する必要があるということです。さらに、例えば建設紛争の場合に、国際的な損害算定専門家や遅延専門家を起用する必要性がどの程度あるかといった点も考慮要素となるということでした。外国の仲裁人の方がこういった専門家の報告書には慣れている可能性が高いということです。最後にベトナムで仲裁が利用されている産業分野としては VIAC の最近の報告書によりますと、商品の販売貿易分野、建設インフラ分野、不動産分野がトップ3ということで、その他銀行金融分野、サービス物流分野が続くということでした。これらの産業分野で仲裁が多く利用されている理由としては、長期的かつ高額の契約が関わること、外国投資やクロスボーダー取引の割合が高いこと、紛争解決に専門的な知見が求められることといった点が挙げられるということでした。次回も引き続きまして、ベトナムにおける仲裁制度についてお届けいたします。次回のビデオシリーズもご覧になっていただけますと幸いです。本日はご視聴いただきましてありがとうございました。